Daniel Hayes had never been the kind of man to snoop. Not really. But marriage had a way of sharpening your instincts. And lately, his wife, Marissa, had been different. Quiet during dinner. Jumping at the sound of her phone. Double-locking the doors at night. Then came the night, she whispered in her sleep. "Don't let them in even if it sounds like me." Daniel froze beside her in bed, staring at the ceiling. When he asked her the next morning, she claimed not to remember, but the seed had been planted. They'd moved into her childhood home 6 months ago. A quaint two-story farmhouse nestled on the outskirts of Ashridge Hollow, a town with more abandoned barns and stop signs. Just temporary, she had promised, until we finished the renovation on the place. But the moment they moved in, Marissa grew distant, and her mother, Lorraine, who lived next door, visited daily, unannounced, always with food, always watching Daniel, just a second too long. It was a stormy Thursday when Daniel heard something odd above the guest room, dragging, faint, like furniture scraping wood. He followed it upstairs and noticed the attic door slightly ajar. Marissa had always told him the attic was empty, just insulation and rat crap. But as Daniel climbed the creaky ladder, flashlight in hand, he discovered otherwise. A single trunk sat in the center of the dust-choked space. It was locked but old. With a hard tug, the latch snapped. Inside, a collection of family photos, all black and white. Dozens of them featured Marissa, except younger, a child, a teenager. But one photo stopped him cold. Marissa's mother, standing next to a man that looked exactly like Daniel. Same face, same build, even the same crooked smile. Except it was dated 1987, and Daniel was born in 1989. That night, he didn't sleep. He watched his wife instead. Who was the man in that photo? Why did he look like Daniel's twin? Why had Marissa never spoken of her father? When he confronted her with the picture the next morning, she went pale. "That's my father, Jonathan," she said flatly. "He died before I turned 10. And no, he doesn't look like you. But he does, Marissa. It's uncanny." She stood, grabbed the photo, and ripped it in half. I said no. Daniel couldn't let it go. That night, he visited Lorraine next door. He needed answers. "Jonathan," she said, pouring him tea. "Strange man, quiet, but he's long gone, Daniel. Buried over 30 years ago. Do you have any photos of him?" She paused. "Too long." "No," she said finally. "House fire took all our memories." Liar. Daniel had just seen a dozen photographs in the attic, untouched by any fire. He stood to leave, his skin crawling. And that's when he heard the tap, a faint knock, from the basement below. Lorraine didn't flinch. The next day, Daniel drove 2 towns over to the public records office. He requested a death certificate for Jonathan Reynolds, Marissa's father. There was none. No obituary. No burial. No Social Security death index. No trace. It was as if the man had never died. Or worse, wasn't supposed to be known. That night, Daniel woke to scratching under floorboards. Not mice. Fingernails. He followed the sound to the basement door of their house. Locked. He'd never seen it locked before. With a crowbar, Daniel pried it open. Steps descended into pitch black. At the bottom, the air was cold, metallic, like blood and metal. The basement was larger than expected. Not dusty, but maintained, like someone lived there. And then he saw it, a trapdoor in the far corner. Fresh claw marks on the floorboards around it. He bent to inspect it and heard the faintest whisper below. "Danny boy, open it. You know who I am." He stumbled back. That voice of his own. He returned to the attic. This time, searching not just for photos, but patterns. There was one more photo, tucked inside an old book, a mirror shot. Lorraine taking a selfie in front of a mirror, and behind her, Daniel again. Not the real him, but the reflection. And in the corner of the mirror, a door, black, ornate, the kind you don't find in farmhouses, the kind you shouldn't open. Daniel confronted Marissa again, this time with a mirror photo. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply said, "You weren't supposed to find him this soon." And then, She walked into the basement. He chased after her, but she was gone. The trapdoor was wide open, and above it, written in charcoal, "They always come back home." Later that night, Daniel sat in the guest room, reeling. His phone buzzed. A new text, no number. It read, "Stop digging. You're not the first Daniel. You're just the first one she liked." Then came a photo attachment. It was a selfie of Marissa, smiling, standing next to Daniel. Except he was still alone in the room. Chapter 1. Whispers in the sleep. It began with a whisper, not a scream, not a cry, just a faint murmur in the middle of the night. Curled in the breath of his wife, Marissa, as she turned in her sleep beside him. "Don't let them in, even if it sounds like me." Daniel Hayes sat upright in bed, eyes adjusting to the darkness. The bedside lamp remained off, but the hallway nightlight flickered faintly under the door, casting long shadows across their bedroom. He turned to her. Marissa's breathing was steady, her face serene. She was deeply asleep, lips slightly parted. Peaceful, almost doll-like. He didn't wake her. He told himself it was just a dream, sleep talk, nonsense. But as he lay back down, eyes wide open, he couldn't shake the tone of her voice. It hadn't sounded like sleep talk. It had sounded urgent, like a warning meant for someone else. Or him. They'd only been living in Marissa's childhood home for a few months. It was meant to be temporary. A pit stop while their real house, a modern split-level suburbs, was being remodeled. But lately, Daniel had started to wonder if they were ever going back. Ashridge Hollow was beautiful in that slow, old-world kind of way. Long gravel roads, weather-beaten porches, and neighbors who knew too much about each other but spoke too little. Marissa insisted the farmhouse had sentimental value. "It's the safest place I've ever known," she told him, "even if it creaks and groans and smells like the 1940s. But from the moment Daniel stepped to the front door, he had felt off, like the walls were watching him. And then there was her mother, Lorraine. Lorraine lived in the cottage next door, alone since her husband died years ago, though no one spoke much about him. She came by almost daily, sometimes with food, sometimes with advice, but always with the same glassy stare. She had a way of entering a room without a sound, and she never knocked. Not once. Daniel had asked Marissa once why she was so quiet. "She's been that way since my dad vanished," Marissa had replied. "It's just her way of coping. She likes silence." But there was something about the way she said "vanished" that made Daniel pause. Not died. The next few nights were uneventful, at least on the surface. But something shifted in Marissa. She laughed less. She barely touched her food. Her phone, once forgotten for hours, now never left her side. She double-checked the locks on the doors every evening, especially the one leading to the basement. Daniel began to keep a mental list. Whispers in her sleep, Lorraine's unannounced visits, a new lock on the basement door, a photograph Marissa kept on her nightstand, a photo of her as a child, but with a father's face scratched out with ink. He told himself not to pry, but when she whispered again on the fourth night, this time louder, "It's wearing my skin," Daniel could no longer ignore it. The next morning, while Marissa was at the grocery store, he decided to investigate the attic. She had always told him there was nothing up there. Dust, maybe an old lamp, nothing worth climbing for. But as he pushed aside the hallway storage boxes and pulled the creaky string to the trapdoor, Daniel felt a cold breeze roll down the ladder before he even climbed. It smelled like dust, metal, and mildew, and something else. The attic was cluttered, not empty, as she claimed. There were boxes, trunks, an old rocking horse, faded clothes hanging from a sagging rod, and in the far corner, under a tarp, something large. Daniel pulled it back and found a trunk, heavy, leather, locked with a rusted latch. He didn't hesitate. He gripped the edge and pried it open with a metal file from a nearby toolbox. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them, Polaroids, old prints curled black and whites. The Hayes family, smiling, growing up in the very house he stood in, and then he found the one that stopped his breath. It was a wedding photo, a faded black and white, yellowed at the edges. Lorraine was unmistakable, 20 years younger, smiling with flowers in her hand. But the groom, the man standing next to her, looked exactly like Daniel. Same face, same build, same sloping brow, even the small scar on his chin. Daniel's knees gave out, and he sat hard on the attic floor. The back of the photo was marked, Jonathan and Lorraine, September 12, 1987. Daniel had been born in 1989. This man couldn't be him. And yet, he stared at the photo for 10 long minutes before hearing a creak below him. The front door. Marissa was home. He shoved the photo into his jacket pocket and quietly climbed down the ladder, heart pounding. She was in the kitchen, unpacking groceries. Daniel watched her for a moment, her expression blank, her body tense. He knew, in that moment, she was hiding something, and he was going to find out what. Daniel didn't sleep that night. The photograph burned in his pocket like a coal. After Marissa went to bed, he waited an hour, long enough to hear her breathing settle, before slipping into the hallway with a glass of whiskey and the picture in hand. He laid it on the kitchen table and studied every detail. Lorraine, smiling, radiant, much younger but unmistakable. Jonathan, the man with his exact face. This wasn't one of those uncanny resemblances. This was him. His brow, his cheekbones, the scar he got at 16 after falling off his bike. Identical. He held the photo up to the light. Tried to find any sign of forgery. A crease, a pasted face, even a digital edit printed on an old filter. But the image was aged, tangibly, physically old. Real. There was only one explanation Daniel could live with at that hour. A relative, maybe an ancestor. But if that were true, why had Marissa never mentioned it? Why had she lied about the attic? Why did Lorraine look at him, always look at him, with that faint smirk, like she knew something he didn't? The next morning, Daniel made coffee before Marissa came downstairs. She walked into the kitchen wearing one of his t-shirts and smiled at him like nothing was wrong, like she hadn't whispered nightmares in her sleep, like he wasn't carrying a secret photograph of her mother with a man who had his face. He poured her a cup. "You ever show me your parents' wedding photos?" he asked casually. She blinked. "No, why?" Daniel shrugged. "Just curious. Your mom ever remarry after your dad disappeared?" Her face changed. Just a flicker. The smile tightening. The lips pressing a little too firmly against the rim of the mug. "No," she said. "Never." Daniel nodded. "Right. Just wondered." Marissa looked at him for a long second, then asked, "Were you in the attic?" "Shit." He played dumb. "Why would I be in the attic?" She stared. Her smile didn't return. "There's mold up there. I don't want you getting sick." He offered a laugh that didn't quite land. Noted. But something unspoken lingered in the air. A current, like she knew exactly what he'd found, and didn't want him looking any further. That afternoon, Daniel walked over to Lorraine's house. The path was short, but it felt like entering another world. Her cottage was older, darker, the windows always drawn. Wind chimes made of rusted keys hung from the porch, and the yard had no flowers, just soft, damp moss that seemed to grow even in the shade. She opened the door before he could knock. "Daniel," she said, voice smooth like oil. "I was just thinking about you." "I bet you were," he muttered, holding the photo out. Her expression didn't flicker as she took it from his hand. She glanced at it, then handed it back. "You found the attic, then?" Daniel stepped forward. "That's not just some cousin or old boyfriend. That's me, or someone who looks exactly like me. Who the hell is Jonathan?" Lorraine turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door wide open. It was an invitation. It was a test. The inside of the house was worse than he expected. Curtains drawn, dozens of candles burned along shelves and windowsills. There were photographs on every wall, none newer than the late 90s. Lorraine sat at the kitchen table and gestured for him to do the same. "He was my husband," she said, before he disappeared. "You mean died?" She tilted her head. "Do I?" Daniel clenched the photo in his hand. "You knew I looked like him. Why didn't you say anything?" Lorraine's eyes glinted. "Would you have believed me? Would Marissa?" Something shifted in her tone. Daniel leaned forward. So what are you saying? That I'm him? I'm saying, Lorraine whispered, that some doors don't open with keys. They open with memories. And when you walked into this house, something recognized you. Daniel's breath caught. What recognized me? She smiled. The same eerie, gentle smile Marissa had mastered. You'll see it soon, Lorraine said. You've already heard it in your wife's sleep. Daniel stood to leave, but Lorraine's final words clung to him like smoke. Just remember, Daniel, she's not the only one who talks in her sleep. That night, Daniel stayed up again. He stared at the photograph until the house was dead silent. Then, at 2:13 a.m., he heard something. Not from the bedroom, not from Marissa, from the basement. A soft, rhythmic knock. 3 knocks, followed by something far worse. A voice. Daniel, let me out. The knock was soft, deliberate, 3 slow, even raps from the other side of the basement door. And then, Daniel, let me out. He froze in the hallway. It wasn't possible. It was a hallucination, a dream he hadn't woken from. But the voice hadn't just sounded like his. It was his, right down to the slight rasp he got when he'd been drinking, the cadence, the pause between words. He stared at the basement door, unmoving, the old brass knob catching a sliver of moonlight from the cracked hallway window. Silence. He took a slow step closer. Then another. The door was locked. Marissa always made sure of that. Daniel pressed his ear against the wood. Nothing. Then a sudden scrape, the sound of fingernails dragging across the other side. He jerked back, heart pounding. Who's there? No answer. Only 3 more knocks. Slower this time. Daniel bolted. He didn't wake Marissa. He couldn't. What would he say? I think there's a version of me locked in our basement. We left the house, pacing under the bare porch light, breath foggy in the cold. The sky was a deep, endless black, and not a single house on the road had its lights on. It was just him, and the voice. He needed answers, not whispers, not dreams, truth, and he knew where to start. Lorraine. She answered the door before it could knock. Again, Daniel stepped inside without asking. Tell me everything. She didn't pretend to be surprised. What did it say to you? He stared at her. It? You mean him. The one in the basement. The one that sounds like me. Lorraine walked slowly to the fireplace and added a log. The room glowed brighter. It's not a man. Not anymore. Daniel said nothing. She looked at him with tired eyes. Jonathan was my husband, but he wasn't the first, and he wasn't supposed to stay. I don't understand. No, you don't. She sat, smoothing the hem of her dress. The house chooses people. It finds those who carry a certain weight, a fracture in the soul, then it shows them a door. Daniel sat, too, cold despite the fire. What door? One only seen when you stop lying to yourself. When you remember the things you buried. Her eyes were like wells now. Jonathan found his, and what came out looked like him, sounded like him, but it wasn't him. Daniel whispered. So what happened to the real one? Lorraine reached under the end table and pulled out an old audio cassette. You need to hear this. Then decide. Do you go deeper, or do you seal the door for good? The tape was labeled simply, July 3rd, 1991. Lorraine slid it into a battered tape player. It clicked a word, and then Jonathan's voice. If you're hearing this, I failed. The door opened again, and it let him out. He looks like me. Please, Lorraine, don't let him near Marissa. Static. Then a muffled scream. He's wearing me. My memories, my thoughts. But he doesn't love you. He doesn't love her. He's just waiting for you to let your guard down. The recording ended abruptly. Daniel felt sick. Lorraine met his eyes. Now you understand. But he didn't. Not yet. Because when he returned to the house, Marissa was gone. And the basement door was wide open. The air in the house was different. Heavy. Still. Waiting. Daniel stepped over the threshold, eyes locked on the basement door. It yawned open like a mouth mid-scream, dark and gaping. "Marissa?" he called voice tight. No answer. He grabbed the flashlight from the drawer. The moment it clicked on, the shadows pulled back in reluctant retreat, revealing the narrow wooden stairs descending into the unknown. Each step groaned under his weight. The flashlight beam shook in his hand. He reached the bottom. The basement was colder than he remembered. The concrete walls slicked with condensation. Boxes lined perimeter, but something had cleared a path straight down the center. A trail. Daniel followed it, the flashlight beam catching on something at the far wall. A door. It shouldn't have been there. Steel. Smooth. Seamless. No hinges, no knob. Just 3 indentations in the center, as though someone had pressed their fingers into it. A small plaque above read, "Only." His pulse thundered in his ears. From behind him, a whisper. "You were never supposed to come back, Daniel." He spun around. Nothing. But then, footsteps. And Marissa. She stood at the top of the stairs, backlit in soft hallway light. Her hair was wet. Her expression unreadable. "Where were you?" he asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she slowly descended the stairs, bare feet padding softly. As she stepped into the flashlight beam, Daniel saw her eyes. Black, like ink poured into glass. "You opened it, didn't you?" she asked, a voice like his dream. Daniel stumbled back. "What are you?" She smiled. "The part of you that never left." Behind him, the steel door began to thrum. A deep, low vibration, like a heartbeat echoing through the walls. And then it began to open. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as the steel door creaked open. Not a mechanical creak, but something wetter, organic. The door didn't swing, it peeled. The slow has escaped a widening crack. The cold air that followed smelled of rust and damp earth, like a grave disturbed after too long. Marissa didn't flinch. Daniel turned toward her, his flashlight trembling in his grip. Her ink-black eyes reflected back the narrow beam. "What's behind that door?" he asked. She tilted her head. "You are." The thrum behind him grew louder. The basement lights flickered violently, one bulb overhead sizzling before it exploded, showering glass. The steel door was nearly open now, revealing nothing but swirling darkness. A shape emerged. At first, Daniel thought it was a shadow cast by the dying lights, but it moved independently, stepped forward. It was him, not just similar, identical, down to the scab healing under his chin from a nicked shave. The same jeans, same shirt, same haunted eyes, but this version smiled wide, too wide. "I've been waiting for you," the double said, voice echoing slightly, as though spoken from the bottom of a well. Daniel backed away, bumping into Marissa. "Make it stop," he whispered. She leaned close to his ear. "You let it in. Now watch what it does with your life." The double raised a hand, and the basement shifted. The concrete cracked. Boxes slid toward the walls. The air bent, folding in on itself. Daniel screamed as he was yanked backwards, his body paralyzed mid-fall, dragged to the still opening door. The last thing he saw was himself, his double, turning to Marissa. She smiled. He kissed her. Then darkness swallowed everything. The next morning, the neighborhood was quiet. Police responded to a welfare check placed by a concerned co-worker. They found Marissa in the kitchen, humming. She offered coffee. Calm, polite, Daniel stood beside her, alive, intact. But something was off. He never blinked. And when the officer asked his name, he hesitated, just a moment too long. Across town, in Lorraine's attic, a second tape began playing on its own. If you're hearing this, he made it out. A pause. But I don't think it's Daniel anymore. The voice on the tape? Marissa's. To be continued.